So last lecture, we talked about early Italian Renaissance sculpture. This time we're going to talk about painting, which came later, depending on how you look at it. And when we get to the end, we'll talk about this beautiful painting by Botticelli. Oh, so there's a lot of places that you could start with sculpture as far as the Renaissance goes. But most people start the early Renaissance, most art historians, with this particular painting by Masaccio, even though it was lost for a long time, but it was known to the people at the time, and people at the time were really impressed with it. It was very influential. So this is Masaccio's The Holy Trinity with the Virgin, St. John, and two donors. So if you're not familiar with Christian theology, they have an idea that there's one God in three persons. So the three persons would be God the Father, who is pictured here. One of the first times that they have God the Father pictured as an old man. They didn't always do that before. And then the God made flesh, or God the Son, who is Jesus. And Christians believe that God, who is an immaterial, eternal, all-loving, all-knowing being, made himself into a man, and that's what Jesus is. And then there's this dove that represents the Holy Spirit, which is God's presence all around basically humanity, more or less. So they don't believe that's three gods. They believe that's one God in three persons. So it's picturing the Trinity here, and it's kind of telling the short story of Christianity, which I'll explain in a moment. So when Jesus was crucified, most of his masculine followers left him. All the men except for one, and that's John, who's pictured here, left him. And then his feminine followers, they stayed with him. So we have Mary right here, and sometimes in a picture like this, we'll see later, she would be pictured with three other Marys, actually. So what's kind of early Renaissance about this is a few things. So we'll go through it as we see it. So the first thing is to show the clean version. A lot of these old paintings, they're sitting in churches being exposed for a long time to candles and dust and dirt, and they start to look worn out. After they're cleaned, a lot of them reveal these really bright colors. And at first, and we'll talk about this later on when we talk about Michelangelo, some of these cleanings were controversial. But there's no reason why they should have been. These bright colors, which seem kind of gaudy sometimes to contemporary eyes, are what was popular at the time. So this is pretty accurate, and I'll get into more detail when we talk about Michelangelo later on. So this one was covered by another altarpiece. It was rediscovered in the 19th century, and then restored to its original position in 1950. Computer analysis shows small changes from true perspective to accommodate the picture form in the space. So what this quote is leading toward is that this is a very mathematical perspective. So it's using Brunelleschi's perspective. And if you haven't already watched the video in the last lecture about Brunelleschi's perspective, it's only a few minutes long. I'm going to post it in the description of this one as well, so you'll be able to see it, check it out, and understand a little bit about the perspective. So in the video, they'll talk about how in making mathematical perspective, you use orthogonals that all lead towards a vanishing point. And you can draw those orthogonals here. That's one of the ways that you make a realistic looking three-dimensional space. So you'll see how the vanishing point leads to a point between here and the bottom picture, which is a skeleton. And there's a very good reason for that. So if you actually do this perspective and you measure everything out, once you know, like say we knew how long this line was, from there, we could actually map out the three-dimensional space of it and tell you exactly how big this thing is. This room was based on this two-dimensional picture. So this is a very accurate way of creating three-dimensional spaces. It's very mathematical. There's lots of, it's a little difficult when you put the figures in there, but everything else is very mathematical. They're using rulers and straight lines to be able to make this happen. So if you look in the left, you'll notice that Mary, she is kind of holding her hand out, presenting as if she's like, on a game show and presenting Jesus. And the reason why is because when she was told, like I mentioned in the first lecture, that she was pregnant with Jesus, she's basically the first person that knew that Jesus was special, that he was something else. So if you look in the bottom, you see a skeleton that says, "I was once what you are, and what I am, you will become." And in Genesis, it's basically saying the same thing in the first book of the Bible. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. And that's a memento mori, which means a reminder of death. In a Christian context, a reminder of death is saying, not just reminding you that you're going to die. Everyone knows they're going to die. But the idea that Christians believe that there's an eternal life after death. So it's best to do the right things and be good in life so that you can have a really good life after death, an eternal life, which is more important. So if we go back, we can see a couple of things that are really interesting. So since the vanishing point is coming here, and we make a triangle here and a triangle here, it's kind of like what I was talking about with Giotto, the short story of Christianity. We have this dead body, which represents the first sin, the original sin. So remember, Adam and Eve, they committed this first sin, and it made it so that humans could die. And for Christians, that's a spiritual death as well, because you can never get to heaven because of that. But then God makes himself into a man and sacrifices himself. And you can see the sacrifice is actually being shown here. And through that, Christians believe they can have salvation. So Masaccio is kind of continuing what Giotto does here, using the composition to tell this short story of Christianity, but using it in a more mathematical way. So one thing I forgot to mention is we have these two figures in the outside and profile. Those are the patrons. So at this time, the patrons, they want to get credit for paying for the painting. So the people that paid Masaccio and gave him the money for all the materials. But they're also supposed to be humble. So they usually show themselves slightly outside of the painting and in profile so that you know that they're not spiritual people. You'll notice that Masaccio puts halos, like we had seen in earlier work on all the figures, but even makes the halos three-dimensional. So the other thing that you'll kind of notice when you look at this picture, besides the complete story of Christianity, is it is made in such a way, when you have this really accurate perspective, it is made in such a way that if you experience it in a very particular way, in this case, by putting a mirror at a very precise distance from the picture, you can get this three-dimensional effect, kind of like these old things called Viewmasters, or you might see like three-dimensional 3D movie or something like that. So it has like kind of a similar effect. So originally there was a hole right here where the vanishing point is, and it would set up a mirror away from the painting, which would point towards the painting. And what you would do is go behind the painting and look through the hole. And when you do that, it creates this incredible three-dimensional effect. It's no longer a 2D painting. It seems to disappear into the background. So a lot of times when they're doing these linear perspective, they're making repetitive elements so that it adds to the illusion. So I'll include this link if you're interested in seeing how research determined that this was the case, like with the mirror viewing, in the description in this video. So Masaccio continued, and he also used other methods besides linear perspective to be able to create three-dimensionality. So one thing you could do now is pause and kind of look at this picture and see what makes it 3D. What is new? So you can go forward to this slide and pause it and kind of like compare what's going on. Like both of them are pretty natural. They have some realness, but Masaccio does some things that Giotto is not doing here. So pause it and try to identify them, write them down, and then you can kind of get an idea on what's new in the early Renaissance. So with Masaccio, the tribute money, in Matthew, it follows Christ's mention of his betrayer and his death and the resurrection. So according to the Gospels, those are the stories about Jesus in the Christian Bible. Um, he knew from the time he was born that he was going to be executed. He knew he was going to be sacrificed. And the week that that came up, and we talked about it earlier with Palm Sunday, um, he started to get stressed because he's also a human, but Christians believe he's a God as well. So he had a Last Supper with his closest followers. And in that Last Supper, he mentions that one of his closest apostles is going to betray him. And I'll talk about that story in more detail afterwards. So they go outside afterwards, and Jesus is approached by a tax collector. And a tax collector is pictured here. And I'll kind of explain why he's pictured that way in a moment. And Jesus says he doesn't have any money. He's just a homeless person going from town to town. So he points out to Peter, who's a fisherman. He said, go catch a fish, and you will be able to find in the mouth of that fish the coins, the gold that you need to pay these taxes. So I'll show you a close-up of that in a moment, but he opens up the fish, and there, the gold is in there. And then we have Peter afterwards paying the tax collector. So you'll kind of notice that all of the figures, Jesus and the rest of the figures, are portrayed in this way that's kind of like a convention for showing people in ancient times. So they're wearing these robes. They're not accurate to what Jesus would have worn, and certainly their faces and hair and everything isn't accurate either. But they were wearing clothes that says to a viewer, this happened a long time ago. Whereas the tax collector is wearing modern clothes. And you remember when we talked about Giotto and about how anti-Semitism was used in that, and they used certain qualities of figures to show that a figure was Jewish. And they're doing that here as well, with the curly hair and the shape of the face and making his skin look a little bit darker. Again, of course, in reality, everybody's skin would look like this in ancient Palestine, but it's still, you can kind of see how that leftover Jews killed Jesus type of thing is happening. And they're associating Jewish people with being greedy, or, in this case, like working for an empire that's occupying them. So if you pause the video and you saw kind of like some of the new things that were going on, you may have noticed the way that the figures are gathered around the circle, and they kind of make a more three-dimensional space in that way. People are faced in different directions, including the tax collector who's faced towards them. You can see how their foot, and this is kind of like showing off, it's using foreshortening, meaning it looks like it's disappearing in the background by being shorter. If he were to turn his foot this way, like some of the other figures are, the same size foot would be longer. There is linear perspective, but it's not so obvious because of the background. But you'll notice that there's a graying of the hills in the background, and that's called atmospheric perspective. That's what happens. If you've been living in Michigan all your life, you may not know, but that's what happens when you see hills in the background. They kind of get bluer or grayer through the atmosphere. So Masaccio is using other techniques to create this realistic three-dimensionality. The other thing that's kind of changed that Giotto had done before, but most medieval artists hadn't done, which is make individual faces. So he's not just having one generic face like we saw with Duccio in the first lecture. Instead, everyone has an individual looking face. They look like different people. And that's something that's going to continue even where they're using particular models to portray different figures. When you get in close in the face, like even a little bits of like facial hair, face shapes are all different colored eyes and hair. When you get in on the feet, they're solid, not like the Byzantine feet where it looks like they're about to float. And even he's using the outline so we can see the fingernails from far away, but I imagine these guys are, walking from town to town, they probably have pretty dirty fingernails and toenails. And this is the fish, and you can see that fleck of gold. This could probably stand to be cleaned to show that a little bit more to complete the story. And then again, you can see the same sort of, anti-Semitic stereotypes that Giotto was using is being used to portray the tax collector. And just in case you didn't get it, they put him in clothes that people would wear at this particular time. So the works made before Masaccio's day can be said to be painted, while his are living, real, and natural. So Vasari is an artist that's writing in the 16th century, and he looks back at Masaccio at that time and he says, yep, this is the beginning of some true naturalism. So when we see this, whose earlier work does this resemble? Of course, Giotto, and you can see same stereotypes going on, but also the space is even more realistic. The proportions compared to the buildings are a little bit more realistic, and by creating the elements we talked about before, circling around the figures, an atmospheric perspective, it makes everything look that much more natural. And that's really what one strand of the early Renaissance is all about, is making things look as natural as possible, just like real life, like you could walk into the painting. So this last one, though, shows quite a bit of emotion. And some of the paintings we're going to look at in the Renaissance, the emotion might be there, but it's not in the face. And this one, oh my gosh, it's there. This is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. And Masaccio's Expulsion is one of the supreme masterpieces of Renaissance art, and an interpretation of the tragic scene of humanity's fall that is perhaps unsurpassed by even Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel's ceiling. And in some ways, I would agree with this, because look at the pain on their faces. Remember, they had committed the first sin. They had realized they were naked, and they are being ejected by God, knowing they're going to die someday, knowing they're going to have pain and hardship. So that's pretty bad. It doesn't get much worse than that. So the painting's been restored. It once had modesty vines. We'll kind of talk about the deal with the church and nudity. And then the rest of it was restored. Some of the painting obviously couldn't be saved, but you'll see how some of these styles will, speaking of Michelangelo, last into Michelangelo. So what's kind of interesting, and I'll tell the story, and I want to ask you what you think about the nudity in this one. So it might be a good thing to put in the extra credit board if you want. So this story in Genesis, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So pretty awful fate for Adam and Eve, and also humanity, Christians believe. So why are Adam and Eve nude in contradiction to the biblical narrative? And how would you interpret the gestures of Adam and Eve? So one good thing would be to do is like pause this and put it in a credit board, or just write it down, something like that. And then once you do that, come back and I'll kind of explain what most students say. They notice that Adam is covering his face and Eve is covering her body. So she's covering what are considered to be private parts of her body, her breasts and her genitals, whereas Adam, he's just out there. He's not covering that. He's covering his face. So how most students perceive this is a way that has to do with gender and what is considered to be for each gender modesty, or what you can show and not show. So unfortunately, still in today's society, some people consider it that men should be strong and not show their emotions, which some people would consider not to be strong. But that's what we're seeing with Adam. And it was definitely the case in Italy at this time that a man wasn't supposed to show his emotions. So instead of covering his genitals, he covers his face, which show his emotions. Again, though, at the same time for women, there was this very patriarchal way of looking at women's bodies, that the thing that they have to be modest about, that the thing they shouldn't show are their bodies. It's almost as if to say, with their loss of innocence, that a woman's body is inherently sexual. And that's an idea that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. And it's the reason why in ancient Greece you see male nudes, which are considered to be heroic. We've already seen that in the Renaissance. And the feminine nudes, which are considered to be taboo. And that really comes from an even deeper idea that men are rational and capable of perfection. That comes from the ancient Greeks and is common in Italy here. And that women are emotional, irrational, and that they're inherently sexual with their bodies. So unfortunately, a lot of those ideas still last in today's society, and most classes have no problem identifying these ideas for that reason. So the gender politics that's common in the West and some other cultures is very ancient, but it's continued through imagery like this. So when we get in close, we can see how much pain Adam's trying to cover up his face, but not being entirely successful. So Masaccio was kind of unlucky, but also precocious. So he dies at 27, but he had created all these works before that. I don't know if I'm 47. Maybe I'm supposed to feel bad that he created all this before 27, but it's kind of amazing. We'll see a lot of artists like this. Art education tends to be, if the artist's family is pretty good to them and recognizes that they're really interested in art and get some good teachers, they can usually get pretty good by their late teens, early 20s. We'll see that happen a few times. So this style, which is basically the rational style, I would say. In other words, they're trying to create images through mathematics, and that's what I mean by rational, that create these realistic images. But there's also, some interesting kind of subjects and conventions that are kind of strange that I have to explain so that they can make sense. So this is Veneziano, and it's Madonna and Child with Saints. So there's our Madonna and Child. That's Mary and the baby Jesus, looking pretty porcelain. Again, they're not interested in making them look like actual Palestinians. But this whiteness is associated with purity in some Western cultures. We see the same thing with the saint over here. This style of painting is called a sacra conversazione, a sacred conversation. So in other words, these people don't all live at the same time. And this person lives at the same time as them, but he's not portrayed in the same time. So the idea is that take these figures and kind of imagine if they were to get together in front of the Madonna and Child. So lots of color and light. And when I'm talking about that, I mean, one thing you can do here is pause the video and identify where the light source is. So there's one light source, it's the sun, and you can identify where it's coming from. So one way you could do that is looking at shadows. Another way you could look at highlights. So pause it, guess, then start it up again, and I'll tell you where the light is coming from. It's coming from, if you kind of, this is easier to do in class, but if you kind of extend the line towards the viewer and up diagonally, you can see the light, and you can see how people are casting some shadows there. There's highlights on everybody's face on this right side and a little bit of shadow on the left side. And by doing that, artists call it molding with light. It's a way to make these figures, which are made on a two-dimensional surface, and make them look like they are three-dimensional, like you could reach into that painting and grab them. If you ever take a drawing class, you'll learn how to do this very precisely early in the class. So the three-dimensionality of the figures is out in that way. You can also see that like they're kind of like curved a little bit, like you've seen. They have this architecture, which adds to the three-dimensionality, again, mathematical perspective. And then the floor, in case you didn't get it, is also mathematical. So the Mary and Jesus looking very porcelain. Again, that's like a symbolism. A lot of Europeans sometimes look at whiteness and associate it with purity. Another kind of gender politics thing, that being a virgin is pure. So John is making a gesture just like Mary did in the earlier Masaccio. And that's because he's the second person to recognize Christ as someone special. So John is Jesus's cousin. And he grows up, he becomes an ascetic. So not an aesthetic, an ascetic. An ascetic is a person who basically sacrifices some part of their body to reach a spiritual state. So how he did that is he moved out to the desert and clothed himself with animal skins. And that's what we're seeing here, although they look more like that would be some nice animal skins. And ate locusts. And for him, that was a way to reach spirituality. So they show him as having darker skin than most of these figures. He would probably be darker than this if he's in the sun all day. And sometimes they'll show him as looking kind of like dirty because he's living outside. And sometimes as having matted hair because he's not even combing his hair. He has a halo. We're seeing the halo is becoming more and more three-dimensional over time. Eventually, they're just going to nix the halos and bring it right down to earth. You can really see the foreshortening in the feet. See how this foot is long, but the one that faces us is shorter. He's carrying a staff, the martyr staff that I mentioned before. So when he becomes this ascetic, he starts baptizing people. And that's a ritual that Christians still follow to this day, where you bathe someone in water and it kind of shows a spiritual rebirth. So he did that. And when Jesus got old enough that he wanted to start preaching to people, he traveled to John the Baptist, who was already pretty famous. And he went up to him and said, can you baptize me? And John basically said, I'm not worthy. He recognized him as someone special, as the Son of God. And then Jesus said, do it anyway. So that's why they have him pointing. He's the second person after Mary to recognize Jesus as someone special. And then they have St. Francis here. I can't remember if I've shown you St. Francis, but he was the most popular saint from the time of his life, which was in the 13th century, for the next few hundred years, and then even today. And he founded an order of monks that we call Franciscans nowadays. So he's portrayed a lot of times in these types of pictures. The other reason why you often see him with Christ is because he had what's called the stigmata. Can't really see it in this picture, but it's an idea that another ascetic practice is to kind of meditate and maybe fast. And you meditate on the passion of the Christ. That means on the death and suffering of Christ on the cross. And through doing this, it was believed that Francis was kind of like struck from heaven with the wounds of Christ and actually felt the pain in the wounds. So that's another reason why he's kind of associated with Jesus in a lot of these pictures. We'll see other figures later on that get the stigmata, which is what that's called. So same thing with John and Mary. And then the other side, not important that you know this, but just in case you were wondering who the dude is with the fancy clothes, that's Zenobius, the first bishop of Florence. So he gets to show up in here, and this is more of a legendary figure. Like there probably was no Bishop of Florence in the 5th century, who knows? But Lucy, another maybe real, maybe mythology figure. But it kind of shows you how a lot of these kind of ancient Roman martyrs are portrayed. She was a person who wanted to remain a virgin, be married to Christ, like nuns are. But she was betrothed because she was from a well-off family to a husband. And she said, sorry, we can get married, but we're not going to have sex. And he was really angry about that. So he tried to burn her, and then he poked her eyes out with a fork. Sometimes, and that's what this dish is for, they'll show Lucy with eyes on this dish. And the idea with this is that Christian martyrs were willing to sacrifice everything, pain, suffering, and their life, which is eventually what she sacrificed, to be able to follow Jesus. So this one, another Sacra Conversazione, using these spaces with very precise linear perspective. And then we have Mary and Jesus, and looking a little less porcelain in this one. We have St. Francis again. John doing his pointing. And then you're probably wondering who this dude is right here. Um, Again, remember when you have someone slightly separate from the figures and they're in profile, that's a real person, and the patron in this case. So it's Federico da Montefeltro. Montefeltro. Sorry, my Italian's not so great today. So the right side of his face was deformed in a tournament. So he's always shown from the left side. And if they ever have him pointing in the other direction, they just use drawings of the left side of his face and put it on the right side. So he's being shown here basically to show he paid for it, but also trying to look humble here and praying to Christ like everybody else. So what's interesting about this one is they have an egg coming out of the shell. A little bit later on, we'll see a shell and the possible symbolism of that. And the egg, you can kind of think of the same thing. So this would be another one. It'd be good to pause and perhaps put in the extra credit board. It doesn't really matter what the right answer is because there's a lot of right answers that could be. But one way to kind of think about this is look at Mary and Jesus and think about what they mean to Christians. Maybe that can help you out a little bit with the egg symbolism. So similar type of picture, maybe a little bit more crowded with Piero della Francesca. So this one is more interesting from Piero. It's the flagellation of Christ. And this one actually takes like a lot of description to explain. So bear with me for a minute. But the story is told in a really cool way through this mathematical perspective. So I think you'll appreciate it. So the first thing is, and I think I had talked about this in the first lecture a little bit, but I'll kind of review it. For a lot of Christians, especially what's now called Catholics nowadays, they believe that it's humans' responsibility for creating the suffering of Christ. And that kind of makes sense if you think about how they think everyone has this original sin that was committed by the original humans, and then God had to sacrifice his body through suffering to give salvation for everybody. But to reiterate that, in the Bible, there's stories about the events, which are called the Passion of the Christ, leading up to the death of Jesus. So I'd shown you one before when we looked at what's the celebration of Palm Sunday for Catholics nowadays. So basically what happens is in the last week of Jesus' death, he comes to Jerusalem, which is the main town in ancient Palestine at that time. And everybody knows him. They've been hearing about his preaching. Some people have heard about these miracles. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, I want to meet this new rabbi. He's the coolest. So if you remember in those pictures, they grab some palms out of the trees and they put down cloaks in front of the donkey that he's using to ride in. They're basically just like, oh my gosh, JC, you're the best. You're so awesome. And then through the week, through a series of events, the people of Jerusalem eventually turn on him. So he is arrested. So Sunday is when he comes into town. People are celebrating him. On Thursday, he's arrested. And then on Friday, he is placed before a crowd. And the crowd has turned on him. So remember the Romans were occupying Palestine at this time. And they had a tradition that during the Passover, which is when the Jewish holiday that was going on during this week, that they would take a prisoner and let one go. So one that was going to be executed. So Pontius Pilate, who's the Roman governor at this time, he goes out to the crowd, and it's this yearly thing they do where the crowd is going to pick who they want released. And he takes out the two criminals. One of them is Jesus. And the other one is this person called Barabbas, who had executed a Roman soldier. Not necessarily a good guy, not necessarily a bad guy, but kind of more violent, shall we say, than Jesus. And he asks the crowd, he's like, he reads the charges and he says, who should I release? And the crowd says, Barabbas. And then they say, he points to Jesus and says, what should I do with him? And the crowd says, and remember, this is a Jewish crowd. This is Jesus's people. They say, crucify him, crucify him. And what this is supposed to mean, and if you're in a Catholic church, they actually play this passion drama out in a church service on Friday of before Easter, which is to celebrate the death and resurrection of Christ. So in that passion play, they have usually the main priest. He plays Jesus. Then they have someone else, like a deacon or someone, play the other parts. And then us in the crowd in church, we're the ones who are saying, crucify him, crucify him. So what that does is it's supposed to encourage everyone to take responsibility for the death of Christ. It's again kind of going along with that crisis of faith thing. It's like we all have us in us that we would actually ask for God to be killed. So now that you have your story, you can kind of understand the very tricky thing that Piero della Francesca is doing here. So the first thing he has Jesus, and he's being whipped. He was tortured beforehand. And we have a figure who's right there who is looking at this scene. And if you look at the way that they're positioned, this figure has his arm like this. This one has, Jesus has one arm bent and another one behind him. And then we can see the other figure standing here. So now go out to these three figures and imagine where you would stand to see these three figures as they are. It would be very similar to where this turban man would be sitting in relation to these figures. So Piero della Francesca is doing this little trick. He's saying, look at this, and look at this person being sacrificed. And he's saying, now look at these three figures in contemporary clothes of the time. This person is being sacrificed. So it's not entirely certain who this figure is, but it's believed that he is someone who, somebody's political enemy, and maybe part of a family that was a political enemy, and he was brought up on charges unfairly, and then executed, or perhaps just like banished or had all his money taken away. So Piero della Francesca is using the Christ story and using this perspective where we see things from certain angles and pointing towards a contemporary event and saying, this is a similar type of thing. So this is a really tricky bit of visuals to tell this story. And it's a really cool way to do it. And we're going to see that continue throughout the class, even trickier throughout the class. So this time might be a good time to pause it because we're going to look at the other style that was popular during the early Renaissance, other painting style. So if you want to take a break, do that, take a break, and then come back. So the other style, and we're looking at Botticelli, who's the kind of main person with this style, that becomes popular during this time, is a more kind of mystical type of style. There's still a lot of naturalism, like in this painting, you can see there's like things that are disappearing in the background, but most of what's going on in the painting is right up front on what's called the picture plane. So right as if you were, imagine the painting was a window, the picture plane is like the window itself. And these figures, it's less important that mathematical space that was created in the other style. Instead, we have a more mystical space. We'll see when we get to what's sometimes called the High Renaissance in the 16th century with Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael, that they mix these two styles together, sometimes consciously in the paintings we see with Raphael. So part of the kind of mysticism or spiritualism that is present in this painting comes from what's called the Platonic Academy of Philosophy. We'll kind of talk about Plato versus Aristotle a little bit later on when we talk about Raphael. But the basic idea is that Aristotle is this kind of like down-to-earth type of scientific person in ancient Greece, and Plato was the person who was more mystical. So you can also say this is transcendent, which means spiritual, to the profane, things that are down to earth. So this Platonic Academy of Philosophy, they're based on people that weren't actually Plato, but later people who sometimes identified themselves as Plato. And they believed that, and this was in ancient times, but the people of Botticelli's time is doing it in this Platonic Academy of Philosophy. They believe that the contemplation of beauty to reach perfection of the soul. So they believe like thinking about beauty, making yourself beautiful, writing poetry about beautiful things and people. And I'm talking about like aesthetically beautiful, and painting aesthetically beautiful things could bring you towards a spiritual state, like closer to God. So it's a mysticism is usually what we call these types of religions, where you have a ritual that gets you into a spiritual state that's closer to the divine, which is another way of saying God for some people. So this is an anti-rational type of view. It's not about this step, this step, this step. Instead, it's like, let's look at beautiful things and make ourselves beautiful, and we can get closer to God. So what's this going on with the birth of Venus? They're taking this ancient subject, and she's thought to be, she's the goddess of love, but more of a like kind of loving things that are sensual, the things that are in the earth type of love. And she's being born, and she's rather modest, but she's shown in this kind of idealistic way. She's floating in on her shell. The people that are to the left and right, we have Zephyrus, who is the west wind that's blowing her in here. And when he's beautiful, and we have his beautiful companion as well. Everything's beautiful. Remember, that's how you get closer to God. And these incredible flowers that are floating. Very mystical, this kind of stuff doesn't happen this is not everyday type stuff. And then we have Pomona, who is the spring goddess. And she is blowing Venus to Cyprus, which is a sacred island, a real island, but a sacred one. And you can see how she's covered with all these plants. Even her dress is covered with plants. It shows, if you're a spring goddess, it shows growth, new things, and youth, which we're really seeing with Venus. But she's born as a full-grown woman, but a youthful one. And this is the first female nude since Roman times. So the Greeks at first had like a taboo, as I told you about the ancient Greeks, about nudes of women, but eventually they loosened up, and with the Romans, they were definitely big fans of the feminine nude. And this was based on a sculpture that Botticelli had seen called the Venus Pudica, which means the modest Venus. This one was based on an old Greek one that was called Aphrodite of Knidos, that was made out of bronze, that doesn't exist anymore. So he's Greek, and it's one of these sculptures of a female nude where you could get away with it if you kind of covered some things. So that's kind of what he was doing, whereas with the modest Venus, they just kind of continue with it. So you can see how the body is pretty much the same. The face is a different type of shape. This was the feminine ideal for the ancient Greeks and Romans. You can see with this Venus, he's using more of what during Botticelli's time would be a feminine ideal. And she is like kind of heartbreakingly beautiful in a way, very symmetrical face and large eyes, a long neck, which is considered beautiful today as well. And this flowing blonde hair, which he thought like, wait, this is in Italy. They do have people with blonde hair in Italy, but it actually becomes very trendy in Italy to color your hair blonde. And that's because Dutch paintings and Dutch products like clothing and stuff like that become popular. And then all of a sudden in Venice and Florence, women were like, yeah, I want to look like these Dutch women with their golden hair. So you see a lot of these paintings with the golden hair. It was just like a trend for a while at the end of the 15th century. Oh my gosh, so beautiful, no matter what reproduction I have of it. So remember, that's the point of this entire picture. It might seem like frivolous or something like that, but for them, it was like pretty serious. Through this frivolity, they could get closer to God. So this style is considered to be kind of an anti-rational style, as opposed to Masaccio and the other artists we looked at that are rational. And I mean that literally with rational. I mean like mathematically created. There might be some math here, but mostly this is about creating something beautiful and otherworldly. Oops. So with Pietro Paradino, we're back to that rational style. Doesn't get more rational than this. The artists basically extend this style as far as they can go, creating these spaces that just seem to disappear forever. You can see that with Perugino. You can imagine it would take like a long walk to get just to the end of the plaza, and then even longer walks to get to those mountains in the background. Eventually, artists will get kind of bored with this sort of thing, but at this time, people are trying to push themselves to make it look as realistic as possible. So with this picture, the delivery of the keys, it's a pretty typical kind of subject that you would see for something that was sponsored by the Pope. And the Pope during this time, and especially later on, will start to see that his authority over all Catholics, so all the people who are in what's called the Western Church, so basically Italy and West, his authority over all Catholics is being challenged constantly. And eventually, it'll be challenged completely and they'll leave their religion. So a lot of the paintings that he wants to put up there is basically justifying his power. So this is one of them. It talks about the authority of the Pope. We see that Jesus is giving Peter, who is believed to be the first pope, and all the popes see themselves as descending from him, the keys of heaven. So this is seen as basically Jesus giving authority to the pope, and in this case, the first pope. So a lot of these pictures are telling that kind of idea if they're paying for it. So there's the tribute money over here, and that's talking about earthly authority versus godly authority. So the Pope wants to say he's on earth, but he's the godly authority. So again, if there's political challenges to his power, he can point to this story where Jesus pays the taxes through a miracle of the earthly authority, but he says, like, you know, the kingdom of God or God in heaven is the more important authority. And then the one where Christ is being stoned, and in a story, it's not something that actually happened, but a story that was told. And you can relate to Pope to that as well. He's like saying, Christ gave me the authority and now you're threatening me. So a lot of this stuff is to kind of protect the Pope. But with this, again, you kind of see how far you can go with this mathematical perspective. Just the space that's created is incredible. And he's taking full advantage of it to create these different parts of the story. So you can compare these two styles. We have the rational style, and that's all about creating these mathematically correct spaces. And then this anti-rational style that is more about creating beautiful things. It's almost like a spiritual ritual. So that's the end of this one.